Hello to everybody, to those who watch and listen us English-speaking auditory. My name is Vasil Pekno. I'm Ukrainian journalist, and I'm observing Ukrainian battlefield and what is going on our battle line through our all this almost 3.5 years of full-scale war. So I invite you to join to this new live video update on Ukrainian battlefield as of June the 4th. Please join to this video. Join to us with your subscribes on our channel, and please put your likes and share this video with your friends, English speaking friends, and also please comment on this video. So I will start with really historical events which are made by our Ukrainian SSU, Security Service of Ukraine, because they are doing something which will be definitely put into the books of history. So let's start.
First, I would like to kindly ask you for a moment to take a careful look at this detailed image right here of this man who is 37 years old and whose name, by the way, is Artem Timofeev. And according to Russian media reports, it was to him that the trucks that participated in the attack by the Security Service of Ukraine on the airfields of strategic aviation of the Russian Federation the day before yesterday were registered, as a result of which, as we already learned yesterday, 34% of Russian strategic aircraft were damaged. We know the details of how this operation took place. And now, well, at least Russian media are naming this man 37 years old. I'll repeat once more. This is Artem Timofeev. And he, in October of 2024, opened a sole proprietorship for freight transportation. It was at that very time, according to reports, that the operation by the Security Service of Ukraine also began to be prepared. In December, he purchased vehicles that later directly took part in the attack. All the drivers of the trucks have now been detained. All of them say the same thing, that unknown individuals contacted them along the way and told them where and when to stop. The drivers of these trucks did not know they were transporting drones. Timofeev himself has been declared wanted. Friends, the reason I'm starting with this and showing it to you is because this is a hero of our time. This is a person who was born in Donetsk, who lived in Kiev for a while, who visited Maidan and supported the revolution of dignity. However, a few years later, he actually moved to Russia, to the city of Chelyabinsk, and obtained citizenship there. And now, with the start of the full-scale war, he has clearly made his choice. If all of this is indeed true, but the heroes of our time need to be recognized and shown. And so, in fact, this man, if it is indeed him, Artem Timofeev, excuse me, he is truly our hero, the one who led to the operation carried out by the security service. I reported this earlier, and yesterday in particular, Vasil Malyuk and the agency also stated that our entire network of agents who directly carried out and executed this operation on the territory of the Russian Federation was withdrawn from Russian territory in advance. So I sincerely hope that this hero does too. Let them not show him to the public, but we will know that he played an important role in ensuring that the Russians lost the wing of their so-called nuclear triad. There is no longer a nuclear triad. Now there is some kind of nuclear duplex, or how should I put it? Who the hell knows? Well, in short, that's the story. I wanted to start with it because we need to know the heroes of our time. And now let's move on to the map. Let's talk about the Sumy region and the north of our country. Because here the Russians have made new changes on the deep state map, and there are further advances of enemy troops, including advances toward Kostiantynivka, and here is this settlement. Besides that, I have already mentioned earlier that it is quite likely that Kindrativka is not so much under enemy control as it is that the enemy is present there. That is, they rush in there on various motorcycles, mostly with varying intensity. As the deep state analysts call this tactic, it's a rush practice, meaning a constant rush by the enemy that doesn't let you rest for even a second. If we describe the actions taking place there, as our soldiers recount, it can basically be described as non-stop, constant movement, constant pressure. Some attack, others come in, and that's how it all keeps happening. That's why yesterday's proposal from the Russian delegation at the negotiations in Istanbul actually looks extremely clumsy. They say, let's pause the fighting on certain sections of the front for 2 or 3 days. For 2 or 3 days, for what purpose? So you can bring in more cannon fodder and then be sure to capture settlements like that same Kindrativka. Well, in short, they come racing in here on motorcycles. They rush into Oleksiivka as well. And there are small enemy groups that attack, put pressure on Andriivka and in the northern Sumy direction. The same story is happening in Novomykolaivka, Vodolahi, and Bilovodi. Right now, the two most impregnable lines for the enemy are actually Yablunivka and Yunakivka. These two settlements essentially operate as a single line, and on the approaches to them, heavy fighting is taking place because the Russians, once again, are trying to use tactics, how should I put it, Hamas-style raids to capture these two villages, but they are not succeeding. Why? Because the northern outskirts have been completely wiped out by Russian aviation, Russian artillery, and Russian drones. Completely wiped out, and physically, it's like if you're trying to claw your way up, but there's nothing to grab onto, you can't hold on to anything. This is roughly the situation we're seeing now in Yunakivka and Yablunivka in the northern Sumy direction, over which the Russians are trying to fight. And as Deep State noted yesterday in their specialized post about the situation in the Sumy region, and I have also previously noted that one of the most dangerous directions developing for us is the settlement of Kotin. It is precisely there that the Russians are now very visibly focusing their main efforts. That is from the direction of that same Oleksiivka. They are pressing towards Pisarivka. Kotin is from the direction of that same Kindrativka, pressing towards Pisarivka and Kotin. What is the logic behind Kotin? Well, the point is that if the occupiers actually enter it, they cut off the supply artery and, in fact, our entire section, essentially creating an operational encirclement over an area of about 20 to 25 kilometers to the northeast. That's why the enemy is pushing here. Will they succeed? I don't think so. I believe that somewhere along the line between Yunakivka and Kotin, the enemy will be simply forced to stop, although they certainly have advantages here. Why is it forced? Because you can't advance so deeply without securing and protecting your flanks and the advance itself. Accordingly, the Russians will be forced to spread themselves thin, to lose concentration, and this will lead to their offensives being less focused. This so-called rush tactic, as deep state analysts describe it, where in a kind of frenzy, groups are constantly replacing one another. This will no longer be happening, at least not with such visible intensity, if they continue to expand elsewhere along the border areas. By the way, for some reason we tend to overlook this, but it's worth noting that fighting is still ongoing in the area of Huyove and in the area of Loknya, although the latter is located on the Kushchina. Here our units continue to hold their positions and restrain the enemy, distracting them and stretching their resources, diverting their attention as well. And these are also actions that deserve to be properly highlighted, But yes, our biggest problem in this entire area is that, unfortunately, we don't have enough people. The enemy has more than enough personnel. They can lose and expend them on an industrial scale, both in terms of manpower and resources. But we simply don't have enough people. And this is a major problem that our infantry faces in this direction. Even the drone operators say, it feels like we're doing everything necessary, but where is the infantry? Are they not here? And this isn't a complaint about the infantry itself. It's about the number of people who are able to hold these areas. Here, first and foremost, it is due to their sheer numbers that the Russians are currently having some success. And how this will be broken up, and it will be broken up, I hope, will happen on the approaches to the first line to a real full-scale defense in this direction. Next, let's move on to the Kharkiv region, because as they say, it's as if I was looking into the water, right? Speaking about these attacks that were carried out last week on the border area of Kharkiv region in the settlement of Stroivka, you can see a small gray zone there. And I said that first and foremost, all these attacks are aimed at allowing the Russians to carry out one of their summer campaigns towards Kupiansk, specifically to capture this settlement of Kupiansk, the key hub of Kupiansk, with the goal, once again, of tearing apart our troops. The Russians carried out their attacks in the area of Fihulivka, literally in Fihulivka just the other day. and they continue to put pressure on Kindrashivka and in the settlement of Zapadne. All of this is not aimed at capturing bridgeheads on the right bank of the Oskil River. They don't need them at all, as they say. They need them so that our troops from here, from the Kupiansk area, will respond to threats and move accordingly to other directions, thereby weakening the defense of the Kupiansk bridgehead. That's what the Russians need. That's why they are putting pressure on many locations, including there towards Strovka and the state borderline of Ukraine. This is their main goal in such actions. For now, it's not worth talking about any success or, conversely, failure of the enemy. Let's put it this way. We're in a standby mode, waiting, observing, watching what's happening in the Kharkiv region, although without a doubt, our soldiers are not just waiting and observing. And they are holding on there with incredible determination, holding the line so as not to give the enemy any advantage in the Kharkiv region. Earlier, I also predicted, and in fact, that's exactly what's happening, that the Russians will undoubtedly try to stir up the south as well during their attacks, meaning Kherson. In Kherson, we are seeing yet another use of these experimental tactics of reconnaissance in particular, as reported by our soldiers. They say that instead of using Mavics to fly, since Mavics can no longer reach deep into Kherson for reconnaissance, the Russians are mounting large spools of fiber optic cable, big batteries, high-quality cameras, and a minimal amount of ammunition on FPV drones. Why? Because, well, it would be a waste not to use the FPV, since if you've already managed to fly deep into Kherson, why not strike with the FPV drone that has conducted reconnaissance, identified some positions, and then directed further strikes, either by other drones or by aviation using guided bombs? Well, it's like, it's just not right not to do it. That's why the Russians put a small charge on the FPV drone's warhead and carry out strikes on the Kherson region. Poor dear Kherson is on alert. Very seriously during these kinds of experimental tactics. Just remember how in the past, Russian drone operators in the Kherson region simply tested and trained new recruits by targeting civilian residents of Kherson. Now the Russians are testing these same kinds of new tactics here. But it's also worth noting that our aviation is also operating in the southern areas, the southern sectors. In particular, right now in the video, you can see how our MiG-29 aircraft is taking out an enemy drone command post operated by drone controllers in the temporarily occupied territory of our south. The MiG-29 launches a strike precisely at the UAV operator's command post, right into the very hut where they are sitting. And now, in fact, we will see the actual impact, the strike itself, and then the consequences of this hit. In reality, this is high-precision Western weaponry in the form of guided aerial bombs like the ASR Hammer or GBU-39. As you can see for yourself, they perform excellently. This kind of strike hits the target right on the mark, and our aviation here is trying to operate to the fullest extent possible. By the way, just like in the Sumy direction, both in the south and in the north, where we clearly lack infantry, since the main forces are concentrated on the Eastern Front, and that makes sense. Other technical means help there, such as aviation or, well, certain drone units, although drone operators are actually very much needed right now, both in the Donetsk direction, which remains and continues to be the main focus of the enemy's efforts. So we have this general line of their advance in the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka direction, let's call it that. I have always said that this line, this penetration into our defenses is dangerous for several reasons. First of all, because from here, the Russians gain a certain perspective for advancing both toward Kostiantynivka as well as toward Mirnohrad, Pokrovsk, and, for example, westward in the direction of Dobropilya. However, right now, it really seems that the moment is approaching when they will have to choose when and where to move, whether it will be Pokrovsk or Kostiantynivka. Accordingly, based on these two considerations, it is obvious that soon the Russians will be forced to choose the direction of their main offensive. Well, in other words, it's unlikely to be Dobropilya. It's unlikely that the Russians will continue to expand further in the direction of Dobropilya. Most likely, the choice will be either Kostiantynivka or Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad as the main location where they will focus their efforts. By the way, we shouldn't rule out the possibility that the enemy who is pressing forward, you can see a bunch of arrows here in the south, in the southwest of Pokrovsk, a bunch of arrows, especially as they approach the Dnipropetrovsk region. It's just that now, for some reason, it's no longer fashionable in the media to talk about how many kilometers or a kilometer and a half the enemy has advanced. People have stopped running around with rulers measuring how close they are getting to the Dnipropetrovsk region. Why? Because it stopped being a Kremlin narrative, which unfortunately often gets picked up and spread by our own media. Now, this is no longer necessary as a narrative for the Russian Federation, and so they no longer use it. Accordingly, and unfortunately, we have to admit, our own media no longer make such statements either. But that doesn't mean the danger has disappeared. Let's put it this way. The enemy still has the prospect of advancing toward cutting off the road to Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, and also of isolating the area from the northern sector. It is also possible that the enemy may launch major attacks on Pokrovsk, while at the same time currently trying to advance in the Turetsk-Kostiantinivka direction. However, in reality, if we look at it, they have been making quite significant efforts here lately. Let's zoom in, so to speak, on this section. Recently, the enemy has expended a great deal of its resources to fully occupy Romanivka and to continue fighting in Zoraya. So, as of now, what do we see? We see that our garrison, which is holding back the enemy in Stara Mykolaiivka, is in an extremely difficult situation. This is, in fact, the current state of affairs here. Why has it come to this situation? Is there really a threat of encirclement here? I don't know for certain, just like many others who try to describe the situation as if they know it 100%. But in particular, on the deep state map, we also observe that the situation here, well, doesn't look like one of the easiest. But overall, in this sector, Romanivka, Zoraya, Stara Mykolaiivka, Russian units, in particular the 20th Motor Rifle Division, have already been refreshed here for about 2 weeks. The fresh division is engaged in very prolonged and intense fierce battles, essentially fighting exclusively for individual villages like Zoraya, Romanivka, and attempting to encircle Stara Mykolaiivka here. And in fact, their exhaustion here is now quite noticeable. A key indicator of events, if the enemy does choose the Kostiantinivka direction, will most likely be the settlement of Yablunivka, which we can see here, to the south of Kostiantinivka. Right now, the enemy is trying to approach its southern outskirts, but if the enemy does decide that Kostiantinivka is the target and takes Yablunivka, that will be a sign that they have chosen the Kostiantinivka direction, and not, for example, the Pokrovsk direction. We also continue to see quite significant intensity of fighting in another area, and we shouldn't forget about the settlement of Bahatir. Even though there is a rather peculiar situation there with the enemy's advances and there is movement from the south, Bahatir is still not occupied by the enemy, just as Odryadny is not occupied either. Essentially, the containment of enemy forces continues in the Novopavlivka direction, even despite the large number of enemy attacks. At the moment, there is still no sign that they can break through this section of the defense. And by the way, coming back to Kostiantinivka, I mentioned earlier that Yablunivka is essentially the first defensive line of Kostiantinivka. And if it is breached, it will mean that the main attack on Kostiantinivka has been chosen directly. But believe me, beyond Yablunivka, both to the south and to the east of Kostiantinivka, the defensive lines in these areas are quite formidable. A number of conclusions have been drawn recently. In particular, new logistical routes have appeared, which are covered with nets on all sides. Apparently, we managed to accomplish this. Where exactly? Well, we won't be telling the enemy here, but there are positive changes, positive developments in this direction. I hope that this positive momentum will not stop, and the enemy definitely won't be able to have an easy walk in Kostiantinivka or show that they can. But undoubtedly, even the events of the weekend, the destruction of the iconic gas station in Kostiantinivka, are a sign of what could happen to the city. And obviously, most likely, it will share the fate of Pokrovsk with the total destruction of everything that remains intact, everything that is important, or basically anything that can be destroyed in Kostiantinivka. Because Pokrovsk is being hit by everything imaginable. The same could await Kostiantinivka, well, in the near future, because the occupiers are closing in there, and wherever they advance, death, chaos, and massive, just absolutely insane destruction follows. And there's one more direction I want to talk about before I finish. This is the Lyman front, because here, friends, the situation is also far from simple. And somehow the Lyman front seems to be falling out of focus. Although just 2 months ago, most of the main discussions about what was happening at the front were centered on it. So on the Lyman axis, you can see, first of all, the Russians advancing toward the settlement of Karpivka. They've pushed out a sort of salient, like a worm, in that direction. In addition, south of Zelina Dolina, the Russians are trying to break into our defenses between Zelina Dolina and Kolodyazi. Besides that, from the Rid-Kodub area, they are trying to expand westward. Additionally, from Katerinivka towards Novyi Mir or Novyi Svit. Actually, Novyi Mir is probably the more correct name. So the Russians are trying to expand these bridgeheads here. Why do they need to do this? I've already talked about this more than once before. The logic behind these actions is to isolate another section of our Oskil bridgehead, to advance to the left bank of the Oskil at some point, in order to isolate the bridgehead on the right bank, on the left bank of the Oskil, into 3 sections: Kupiansk, Vuzlovi, Borova, and Lyman, and then to cut the big elephant into small pieces and try to swallow it. These are the main objectives the enemy is currently trying to accomplish here. However, despite the negative trend here in the Lyman direction, it is still worth acknowledging that the 20th Combined Arms Army, which is conducting its offensive operations here, has recently shown a decrease in the intensity and number of attacks and assaults, as well as a significant slowdown in the pace of their advance, which is noticeable even to the naked eye. So that's the situation at the front, friends. On that note, I will clearly put an end to today's review. Thank you for your attention. I wish you to take care of yourselves. Well, until we meet again.